Hello, everybody, and welcome to a fireside chat with two leaders of the Ember project, Yehuda Katz and Ed Faulkner. My name is Leah Silber. I am on the Ember core team and one of the folks working on EmberConf, and we're so glad that you could join us today. If you don't have your ticket yet for the 19th, go ahead and grab one at EmberConf.com. There's a ton of amazing content headed your way, and we're excited to see you there. Today, we're going to hear from Ed, we're going to hear from Yehuda, and they're going to talk a little bit about what happened in the past, what's happening in the future, and some of the thoughts and conversations that go on behind the scenes to help make Ember what it is today and what it's going to be in the future. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to you two folks. Take it away.
All right. Hello.
Hello. Nice to see you.
Yeah.
These trying times.
Yes. Do you want to start by telling me what you're working on today and lately?
Sure. So right now I'm still working on the Keynote, which is basically all Polaris all the time, which we should talk about. I am also, the other thing I'm working on in the background is a project called Starbeam, which is a funny thing. It has two different stories depending on which audience I'm talking to. I'll start with the Ember audience, which is you. Hi guys, hi Emberinos. The Ember story is that it's basically like Glimmer 2, or it's like Glimmer 3, in the sense that it is an extraction of the reactivity model from what Ember does right now to make it more general, make it less coupled to Ember specific details, and in general to take the lessons that we learned from Ember and re-envision some of the details. That always sat, whenever I say that the first time, people are like, I don't understand what the point of any of that is. The point is basically that the process of extracting something into a more platonically ideal starting point helps clarify some details. And in particular, one of the things that we really get out of this is a starting point for a unification of all the APIs, the helper API, class-based helpers, modifiers, all those stories, resources which are coming. All those stories have slightly different APIs or very different APIs. There's third-party packages that have yet even more APIs, but they all are really talking about the same thing, which is it's a reactive computation of some kind that has a value, maybe has some cleanup code or something like that. And there's no reason for them to all be so different. The good news is Ember has we have a manager pattern in our architecture, which allows us to not have to care if we radically change the API surface, and that's how Glimmer Components was able to exist. So that means it's not a big deal in some sense. On the other hand, it's really, I've been working on it for 3 or 4 months now, and we have gotten to the point where it really works. This morning I was for a few minutes was writing a database library, not Ember data exactly, but more like a Redux flavored Ember data library, just built on the primitives, and all the tests are just passing. Right, and so it's basically a update of what Glimmer tracking is to encompass more parts, like the modifiers, all those parts of the story, and also encompass setup and teardown in a way that is more rationalized. That's the Ember story. The bigger picture story is that unlike Glimmer, which was really focused on just that part of the story, the Starbeam story is really focused on trying to make sure it really does work in other ecosystems. That doesn't mean that other ecosystems are going to be prioritized over Ember. I work on Ember and I care about Ember, and that is the most important thing. But maybe we'll talk about this later. A theme of Polaris in general, and which started from Octane, is figuring out how to make the stuff that we use stuff that everyone else uses. Right. So where Glimmer, in some sense, Glimmer can't really be used inside of React except as a iframe, right? A logical iframe. It is much easier to imagine using our reactivity library inside of React, but there's a lot of details. And so part of the work I've done, if you look at the repo, a big chunk of the work is actually getting things to work with React. React has a lot of it has weird strict modes. It has React will just randomly run your teardown functions at unknown times and a lot of different hooks and stuff like that. So figuring out how to model the reactivity model in a way that would feel natural in React is just a project. And we're going to do the same thing for Vue and for Svelte. So I think Svelte we're going to start doing next week. The we is me and Chirag and Tom, who worked on Ember with me in the first place, and Chirag, who has been behind the scenes Glimmer contributor for a few years. So we're going to start working on Svelte compatibility next week. And just the general idea here is we want to be able to say, just like we can say about package v2, which I'm going to ask you about in a minute, like just like we could say, this is something that makes sense for everyone to use. The Starbeam story is like front loading in some sense. The MVP includes, it really does work. It really does fit into the reactivity models of other systems. And one last point is, I now have a pretty, like, I care for, this is like my academic project, is like understanding reactivity better. And I think the Starbeam has closed a lot of the gaps for me in like explaining what is reactivity. And I actually want to we should talk about this as a dedicated topic soon, but I'll just plant a seed, which is like, there's a meme going around that like React is not really reactive, and I disagree with that meme, and I think I want to talk about it soon.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Any
I have plenty of questions I'd like to ask about reactivity. Yeah, I mean, like, so it sounds like this is a nice attempt at standardizing what we need for, not just, reactivity goes beyond a function call, right? Like a function call has a beginning and an end, and there's a return value, and then you're done. Reactivity goes beyond that and enhances that to something that has incremental update, right? And that's really an important foundational piece of what it's got. When I think about a standard like web components, I feel like that's the missing piece, right? For people to actually like use web components in Anger, they need reactivity that isn't there in the standard.
Or any kind of data flow that is not based on strings, I think. Like there's just no way to pass data around in web components. You can build a thing on top of it that lets you try to do that, but web components themselves only let you pass values as strings or imperatively. There's no declarative way to pass data.
Exactly, right. So it does seem like a gap in like just like broader ecosystem, whether de facto standards or formal standards. It seems like a gap. It'd be great to close.
I think I want to reframe what you said about incremental updates a little bit, which is I think that this is an Ember innovation, but I think it is applicable broadly. A better way to think about it is that you have input storage, mutable input cells, or something like that. Like think about the Excel model, right? In Excel, you have a spreadsheet. You have some things that are just like cells you're allowed to edit, and some things that are formulas that you can change the formula, but you shouldn't edit the formula, right? And that whole thing I call the data universe. That's what I'm planning on calling in the keynote. And that data universe has no tear down. There's no cleanup there. The cleanup is the garbage collector. And also there's no output other than like you could ask what the values of the formulas are. And the reason I'm going to say what the other side is in a second, but the reason I'm putting the cut there is that the data universe can be understood without understanding reactivity at all. Because like how do you look at a value? You have to ask for it. And the value should just be the value, right?
Yes, it's timeless.
Right.
It's time-free programming. It's purely referentially transparent.
Exactly. And that's what functional programming means, right? So that's what people mean. So that's like the data universe. But then there's a problem, which is, okay, well, the output is not a person. The output is a thing that needs to be kept up to date. And if we don't have reactivity, an answer to that question, and this goes back to the old backbone spinning circles demo, a thing that you could totally do is just like keep executing the program every single time. And every single time you execute the program, you get a new DOM, and maybe you do some tricks there. But that's equivalent to what the reactive system is doing, other than it like breaks your selection state and stuff like that. However, what people mean by reactive is that you're doing better than that somehow. And in my opinion, the way you're doing better than that is that your data universe is described in terms of mutable cells, and it's described in terms of formulas or computations. And then you have a declarative system for saying how to take those computations and turn them into output nodes, right? So in my reactive model, the output is a very important thing. It's first of all, it's not an effect. It's like a lot of people model, it's so different than console.log. It's not that. I think if you model as an effect, you end up having to do a lot of work for no reason, right? So it's an output data structure, which is the DOM is something that is semantically equivalent to polling all the inputs, all the computations that need it, but also doesn't do that and is declarative, right? And I think in this case, JSX counts as declarative, right? The declarative means it's you say the what and not the how, and in this case, the what is what it should look like in the output, and the how is how you get from state to state. And JSX is a perfectly good answer to that, right? So if you look at so that's the model. If you look at React, right? React has use state and I'll just say use state and use reducer are ways of getting mutable state. And then there's you could either write computations or you can use memo to make computations with invalidation rules. And then the output is JSX. And the framework, I think every single framework works like this, but the framework is modeling how do you take that declarative system and actually turn it into an incrementally updating DOM, right? The reason I said I want to quibble here is that a lot of people think of the computations in the middle as the same thing as output, right? The computations in the middle, you could literally remove. It's hard to do it in React, and this is a design principle of Ember. In Ember, the rule is you're supposed to be able to remove the annotations. You can remove the attract. If you had a unit test on that class, everything would work because the unit test can't actually be a reactive output. The unit test can just ask what the values are of the computations, and you use getters or use functions or use methods or whatever, right? And so the annotations are a layering on top of a normal functional model.
Yes.
Which might happen to use classes. That's a confusion. The fact that class keyword exists doesn't mean it's not a function. It's data oriented, right? You're using functions and methods to get data. You're not using them mostly to mutate things when you're not knowing that, right? So there's basically that. And then there is another part of the system, which is an output data structure that is logically doing what the unit test is doing, but it's supposed to be doing it automatically in a way that is imperceptible to the human being, right? And that is a different thing. That is the output data structure. And the reason I'm keeping on harping on this is because it really narrows down what that has to do, right? For example, Solid.js just says everything is effect, right? And that means that even the output data structure is a very generic thing. Whereas when I did all the analysis in Starbeam, the only effect that everybody ever talks about as an effect is log, right? Log is a special case. It is in Ember also. The reason log is a special case is because normally it doesn't. What happens in between state transition doesn't matter, right? Normally, if you go from A to B to C, you're allowed to we have a thing called action in Ember, and we have something like that in Starbeam, which is when you click on something, you can just make a lot of mutations. You can look at the output right away. React doesn't let you do that, but Ember and Starbeam do, right? You make a bunch of changes. If you look at the mutable cell that you mutated, it's changed. That's the unit test rule, right? So you did all that, and then I'm losing my own train of thought. So basically, you have these actions. You mutate the data universe, right? And then at some point the thing has to be updated. At some point there's been a lot of transitions in between, right? You made a lot of mutations, but none of them matter. And this is also a thing RxJS doesn't handle that well, right? You basically any stream-based thing is seeing all the intermediate states, whereas this is saying except for the output. The output is eventually going to reduce all that computation down to a string, because the DOM is made out of strings, right? So except for the output, we don't care about intermediate states. And the reduction of all the things that you did in between into a string is a very epic reduction, right? And log doesn't want that.
Yes,
right.
exactly.
Log actually wants to be seeing all the intermediate states.
Explicitly point in time. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, I think functional programming means a lot of things to a lot of people. It gets a lot of cultural cachet because I think there's a certain stage in our development as programmers where it's extremely appealing and it looks like a silver bullet to a lot of problems.
Well, I think just being more explicit about inputs and outputs that were caught the bane of your existence is a thing that's appealing. I find it
exactly. I mean, I think Excel is a really instructive model that I use as a strong analogy a lot of the time. It's definitely the most successfully broadly accessible programming environment in the world, and there's a lot of good lessons there. And it's a lot of it comes from it being timeless, and yet you can't sweep under the rug that problem of as soon as your program meets the real world, you can't be timeless anymore. You have to deal with mutation, and there is just mutation in the world. You are not copying your computer every time you write a byte. It's mutating something.
Right.
So,
I mean, you can literally make an Excel UI in either Ember or Starbeam that is literally like a tracked array of tracked arrays and renders, and it will be fast.
Yeah.
Right. I think that's a notable.
It's pretty cool. Yeah.
Right. I also the very last thing I want to say on this topic is that I think the life cycle has caused a lot of confusion in that in Ember, React, and everybody else, there's 10 lifecycle methods or 5 or whatever, and it makes it seem like they're all equally important. There is really only one that really matters, which is cleanup, And that is, in my opinion, that's why hooks are successful, is that they give you a way of composing cleanup. And that is like one of the last frontiers for me, is making the reactivity system able to handle cleanup. Because the thing that's important about cleanup compositions, you have to link things together, right? Normally the garbage collector is good enough, but now you'll need to tear down a WebSocket or something. So you need to connect that thing to something that's going to get torn down, which is probably a component, and that thing needs to be connected to a parent component, et cetera. And Glimmer does that already, but making that more generic, so it's not coupled to like the Glimmer template model, is important. And I think if you go back to the Excel model, that would be, imagine that you could have a type of cell that's like a WebSocket or something, right? So the cell is actually getting its data from WebSockets.
Yeah.
That has to be implemented as something that sets up a WebSocket. If you delete that cell, you really want it to tear down.
Yeah.
Right?
I think connecting this back to like day-to-day experience of Ember developers, I could think of some very specific examples to relate it, which is that you get so much nice reactivity when you do things in templates that sometimes we don't have a way historically to always to spell the same reactivity in JavaScript, and it causes a disconnect, right? You end up not being able to slice your logic between HBS and JS exactly how you would have wanted to, because the reactivity story wasn't always unified, right? And
I used to have a slide about this point in the keynote, the like making it easier to refactor. And it is in the Polaris sketch document that is going to eventually become the Polaris RFC. But it ended up being like, at some point you have to, it's like, object-oriented hierarchies, you have to figure out how to slice it. And it was just, it didn't end up being a slice that fit the flow. But it's an important point that right now, like there's not a good way to refactor easily between those two contexts. And like a goal of Polaris is to close that gap, including teardown.
Yes, spelling out the, it touches on other areas that are interesting to me and exciting. Like the glint support, the really first-class TypeScript support. All of that really requires us in a deep way to rationalize what is the type of the things we say in the handlebar side. All the things that you can invoke in a template. What's their commonality? What's the shared signature? How are you model? And once you've done that work, you really can model everything as you're unifying the worlds, right? It's not a hard split anymore.
And I think people very superficially tend to think that, like JSX just has a JavaScript expression here and handlebars doesn't. So like, what does that mean? And I think like, ironically, handlebars picked a much restricted subset intentionally to make it map very nicely onto simple JavaScript expressions, and not to allow you to do things like X++, which wouldn't make any sense in a reactive context. So it maybe in a perfect world, we would have a subset of JavaScript that you could use there that doesn't include things like plus or assignment expressions. But it's just not that hard to map the template expressions, the parentheses syntax, onto JavaScript calls. And that's more or less what we have done with both template tag and being able to put helpers in line, is just like making that mapping explicit. And and the glue space is like, between all those things, the rubber meets the road. We don't have a lot of spaces to hide cheats anymore.
Exactly. Right? I got to definitely use Glint with all of the latest in an actual project to where it was worth it to kick the tires on that stuff, and it's great.
I've also been
turned on
using it.
Just little things also, like turning on the polyfill for having a helper manager for plain functions. Now it's just it composes very elegantly. It's very
I think it's also worth noting that like one of the things that's nice about the manager concept, which is basically like a helper is like the union of all the helper APIs in all of Ember, but there's only one that exists right now. That system allows us to do things like just turn functions to helpers and have a good, like, it doesn't require huge changes in the whole system. It requires having a default helper manager. But that's the whole architecture of that, and I think that's pretty nice.
Yeah, exactly. And the implementation story works out nicely then, right? Like it was all straightforward to implement third party, and
you don't have to go into Glimmer VM and do anything.
Right. Exactly.
That's good.
Yeah.
Okay, I should ask you about Embroider.
Sure.
Tell me about Embroider.
Yeah, I mean, so that's definitely my open source focus. Embroider's come really far. I'm really happy with how the level of contributors we have now and the level of apps adopting. Embroider is the next gen build system for Ember. It's really it's a big project because we really are doing a kind of push and pull meet in the middle thing here. What I mean by that is we put a lot of work into getting as much compatibility as is reasonable, but there's at the same time, the whole point of this is to get the ecosystem onto better patterns, stricter patterns. And so there's a bit of a give and take in terms of embroider adoption. And like, it's always pretty fascinating when I get a new app adopting the kind of bugs that we find right away, stuff that you just missed because like the older system wasn't as strict, and now you're dealing with more strictness, and you get immediate feedback on things that were missed before. Things like,
what kind of strictness do you mean?
Well, like for example, some of it is the silly stuff. Like for historical compatibility reasons, you can mix up your module import with your default import and get away with it in the classic build, and all of a sudden embroider starts pointing out all the places where you violated the module spec, right? Or even just stuff like people using patterns where they're deliberately mutating a module from the outside, and that's a spec violation, but embroider will catch that. And yeah, so stuff like that, where there's definitely, I say it as a give and take, because purely as an app author, if you're just like wanting to try it out, all of a sudden it's telling you there's all these problems, and it seems like, well, why is my app broken? Well, it's really trying to help you get onto standards, get onto stricter patterns, get more correctness. And all of that is in the service of letting us analyze and optimize the app much better, right? That's why it can split all your code on the routes and all that sort of thing. So
can you talk a little bit about the difference between embroider used as a drop-in replacement for Ember CLI's current bundler and the strict mode approach?
Sure, yeah. So we definitely, the way we have it set up is when you just install it and follow the instructions in the README, you're starting out in the most compatible mode that we've got. And that covers an awful lot. It's usually not too big a stretch for apps to adopt, because we've tried pretty hard to keep a lot of the legacy behaviors behind.
Do you think by the time Polaris lands, we will be able to close enough of the gaps that we just say that that's the default mode? The compatibility mode is the default mode for everybody.
Yeah, definitely. That's my goal, is to get to there. I mean, it's a consensus thing, right? We have to go through the process, get all the legitimate feedback from the community. We've done a few rounds of that already. Like there was an RFC saying, hey, let's make this the default for new apps, and there was some good feedback there. And we could look at that again and say how much of that is addressed and how much of that is in scope or not. There's going to be definitely a long tail of add-on behaviors that are not going to come across. Some of them are just things where you could spend more effort and get compatibility. Some of them are just like things we have to say are a bad idea.
What's one example of that?
So a big one that people hit is the there's a hook in Broccoli that add-ons like to use, the post-process all tree, which effectively lets them rewrite anything at all about the whole application at the end of the build, right? And when that's in, so for one thing, we can't really give them a backward compatibility way to run that, because the app doesn't look the same anymore. The input that hook would see after Embroider has built the app is different, because we don't generate exactly the same output anymore. That was all implementation detail. That was kind of a bad idea to rely on. And the kind of thing I mean by implementation detail is that like there's this assumption that there's going to be one file called vendor.js and a file called your app.js, and that's exactly where all the JavaScript is, and it has this very fixed relationship. The whole point of being able to go to Embroider is you don't want that anymore. You want to be able to dynamically split code. You want await import to work. You want all these modern JavaScript features to work. And if that's true, you can't just assume that you know that exactly what all the JavaScript bundles are, right? There's got to be a bit more flexibility there.
At some point in the future, we could imagine having like a pluggable optimization step that people can implement, but that's like has nothing to do with the thing people are doing now, right? Like you can imagine having a way to plug in something that actually sees some representation of the tree that we did standardize at the very end. So like, for example, maybe you have a CSS optimization step or something like that.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think you could design a new step to satisfy that. Yes, exactly.
And you would want that to be happening at the chunk, like the per route level. You wouldn't like the definition of what is the whole app actually has changed and stuff like that.
Yes, exactly. And you'd want that step to happen before the final bundling, right? The whole app optimization. You want it, or just an example. Another is that Embroider really because of the because of this, the embroider really goes all in on HTML as your entry point. So historically, it's just very implicit is what are the pieces of an Ember app and how do you boot it? It's like you just expect that your build is going to spit out a certain couple JavaScript files that you then are responsible for putting in script tags in your index.html. A way to think about this is that when you write app/index.html in an Ember app, classically, that file is when it addresses other files like script source equals, it's addressing output files of the build. And whereas every other kind of interfile reference you author in your app folder is an input file, right? Your imports in your JavaScript are all talking about input world of the files I authored. And they're not talking about output world of what chunk did it end up in, or is it in vendor.js or not. That file was inconsistent. Classically, it talks about output world. It really should be talking about input world, right? So if you think about expressing an app that way, now we don't need to have any implicit knowledge about what is an Ember app. The rule literally is here's an HTML. If you executed it following the browser standards, that's the Ember app, right? So it's, for example, like I think we haven't formalized yet and published a V2 app format. Like how will you author an app completely natively with no compatibility backward story? We've been focused more on the compatibility story yet, but that native embroider experience, you expect to see, for example, in your index.html, script type equals module, src equals /app.js, right? Like logically, that's what you're saying. You're expressing the intent, run my app here. And then
what about app.ts?
Sure. I mean, I think that would be acceptable to say that.
I
think
that's not a browser thing. How does that work?
Well, I think that in practice, whatever build tool we adopt, and a big piece of embroider is not tying our Ember architecture to one, but to make it so that we are able to express our apps in standards ways. Whatever final bundler JavaScript-based tooling you're going to hand off to, I don't think any of them can really take off today if they don't have a story of TypeScript support, a story for extensibility. So it's true that it's deliberate that we want to be able to lean on that existing ecosystem investment for these kind of tooling, right? Like for example, if we had to have the story of if us and our ecosystem have to do like an order n work to support n popular things that are out there, that's expensive and bad. But if what we can present is an API that is almost entirely expressed in terms of standards and de facto standards, an example of a de facto standard would be something like node modules resolving, then when it's time to do all of those integrations, all that glue work, it's not Ember specific glue work, right?
Is it correct to say that there's basically two options for index.ts? One of them is, it turns out that there's a de facto standard that a directory containing TS files does something, and therefore it's fine to treat that as the output format that we're going to hand off to the bundlers that we support. And option two is, it turns out that that's not true, so we need to do a Ember specific preprocessing step first to turn TS into JS, and then we hand that off to the bundlers, but we would prefer not to do that. We would lean in the direction of doing the first one.
We'd lean in the direction of the first one, right? I think because that's where the sweet spot is in terms of getting the most bang out of the rest of the JavaScript.
But for example, handlebars templates have to do the second one.
Yeah, although even there, right, I think if a lot of the refactoring we've done to make embroider happen makes it much easier to implement the handlebars preprocessing under multiple different environments, right? Like the classic way it's done is deep inside of a bunch of Broccoli transformations that are hard to translate logically into, okay, well now do it in Vite, and now do it Vite, and now do it in Webpacker, and now do it in Snowpack. Whereas the transformations embroider uses are much easier to just drop into those contexts because they're aligned with that way of thinking. Like effectively, customization is okay. Like I'll say two things about extensibility. One is that it's really important that it's an app author concern, and it's not imposed on app authors by the ecosystem of their add-ons. So for example, if every add-on gets to bring its entirely own custom build tool, then you're never going to be able to like evolve. Like, or
if one add-on uses Webpack and one add-on uses Rollup, then how do you make an app? How does the app do any kind of optimization?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's not to say that some advanced add-ons that want to offer build time integrations won't, like if you want to do fancy stuff, you may very well be expected to offer your users some kind of utility that makes it easy to plug into the packages that you choose to support, right? Like trying to be completely agnostic. There's certainly like we can keep pushing in that direction to standardize things.
But I think there's a difference between I'm trying to do something in Webpack and I have a transformation that is a one file at a time transformation from that HBS file to JS, which like really logically every single bundler supports.
Exactly. So, and that's kind of what I was going to say. That's the second part. So the first part was, like extensibility and customizability of the build pipeline is okay, but it's an app author concern that you don't want to get imposed magically by the add-ons, because otherwise it's very hard to evolve it. And the second is what you were saying about like thin transformations, especially file to file transformations, very are much more low stakes and not a big deal, right? Because all of the existing stuff that gets popular kind of has to have them, and nobody can really get popular unless they have a story for how they're going to do these things. Because if you can't, if it can't compile Svelte templates and it can't compile JSX and it can't compile TypeScript, nobody's going to use it. So like it's just expected that like loader as a concept, not necessarily any specific API, but like Rollups API versus Webpack's API, but the general concept of just like, what do I do to this file to make it be a JavaScript module?
Yeah. It's like a thing that takes an entry point and then like uses ES imports to follow the next ones, and then uses whatever you configured it for file transformations to process them.
Exactly.
Like
there's a relatively natural interleaving point there of like, okay, I've decided I want this file. Please give it to me as a JavaScript module, right? And I think that's a low stakes spot to allow customization at the level of apps. So people still get that. It's just that we don't want to, what we have today is much more that every single add-on package can just have a completely different idea of how that happens and bring their own, like, add-ons today, when I say today, like there's plenty of V2 add-ons already today. The classic add-ons, they aren't really libraries, they're programs that emit libraries, right? And we would like them to just be libraries so that they're much more amenable to tools that understand JavaScript.
Yeah, it seems to me, correct me if I'm wrong here, it seems to me that the ecosystem has been evolving a lot towards isolated module, like what TypeScript called isolated module mode, in the sense that I think a few years ago, it was pretty normal to have tools like TypeScript that would try to do fancy things between modules, but that intrinsically is hard to plug in the way that we're describing. So every bundler has to do like pretty complicated things to support, for example, content enums in TypeScript. Again, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems to me that everybody has moved away from making that mandatory, and also the ecosystems have been shying away. So like on balance, a TypeScript developer is less likely to use const enums now, and more likely to think that it's a good practice to use isolated modules mode than before. And that means that like the one at a time plugin story is pretty viable.
Yes, exactly. And I think it is definitely a trend across all JavaScript. I think it's pushed. I think the web standards themselves are pushing it, right? Because I think everybody who works on ES module handling systems is aware that like browsers do more and more of that natively now, and it's nice to lean on that when you can. And once you're doing it in browsers, you're not gonna you've given up your control over the big graph traversal step, right? You can still do one-to-one stuff, and there's a bunch of strategies for that. And one is that if you just have a web server that serves files that go through a thin transformation one by one when they're asked for, and the browser is the loader that does all the module traversal, you get
that's your demo from last year's.
Yeah, well, I mean that's like the Vite Snowpack story, and then what I took it to last time that I demoed, and I've gotten to push a little further on some of those kind of things. I'm still very bullish on Service Worker as a dev tool. That's
100%.
That's the second. That's the next piece, right? Which is not even having a web server, but having a service worker. And now, I just put together working on some Spike ideas. The project where I was using Glint and all of that nice new stuff, I implemented all of Glint and the compilation it needs in Service Worker so that you can like interactively make GTS and GJS components and run them in the browser, and edit them in a Monaco editor and live preview them.
I think the critical thing there is if you want to run stuff in Service Worker, you are going to get requests one at a time, and you will need your transformations to run in universal JavaScript. So you first of all can shed all the ecosystem that is forcing on you whole app transformations other than for an optimization step, right?
Yeah.
It's still fine to do that, but you don't need to do it.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
And then you also need to make sure the ecosystem isn't like gratuitously relying on FS or something.
Yeah,
which
you
don't
definitely
need.
still find quite a bit of that. Yeah.
Right.
I mean,
but that ecosystem is a good. It's a natural consequence of all of this, and hopefully will happen.
Right.
Like I think.
Right. Yeah, and it's definitely getting easier. This most
like I think now the
did
ecosystem wants to support it, even though they don't know that yet totally.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's getting on more people's radars, and in like the general, you gave the example of TypeScript using isolated like per module compilation more. I think another example is just how I think the SaaS community has recognized that they need to go to SaaS modules, not the classic SaaS architecture. And I don't know if you followed that story, but it's a similar story, right? It's that classically SaaS
I followed
is a
it, but found it very confusing. As a user, do not know what's going on there.
Yeah, so like classically SaaS is a bundler, right? It wants to do its own traversal of all of the SaaS modules and effectively do a build, its own parallel build of all the styles separate from the application. And that's really in tension with a world where apps are, automatically sliced and diced and delivered incrementally, because you really do want your styles participating in the same dependency graph as your code, as your JavaScript. And the classic SaaS model doesn't really do it that way, right? It's a whole separate build with its own graph traversal. And if you try to use that mode and like actually build separate mini entry points for all of, like say every component getting its own styles, and you're going to treat those as separate entry points, SaaS will do very bad things if you're using the classic mode. If you adopt SaaS modules, it works more like ES modules, where you can express dependencies on things, and like common dependencies won't get duplicated; they'll be split correctly. And so there's another example, I think, of the trend, and it's there. Like if your dependencies haven't adopted modules, it's you got to kind of push them to, or wait, or help them to, because today it's not always easy. But yeah, it's another example.
Okay, I think if we've been talking a lot about TypeScript, so we can maybe move on to talking about TypeScript, which is another big theme of all the work we're doing. It came up in both of the things we're saying.
Yeah,
for a reason.
Yeah, definitely.
So what do you want? How do you want to talk about it?
Well, yeah, I mean, just like, I guess I'd say the high level, kind of filling people in on the basic story of what's been going on lately, because we did just merge, successfully get consensus on a bunch of useful RFCs around TypeScript in Ember as a first class thing. I think that it has worked in Ember for a long time, right? Ember CLI TypeScript is very widely used. I think it's like one of the top.
Yeah, Kristen had a talk last year at EmberConf about Tilda already migrating to using it, and successfully by last year. So yes, it's one of the top add-ons.
Yeah, exactly. And so like people have been using it. I mean, TypeScript I think is popular for good reasons. I think there's a lot of benefit to TypeScript. If people are unsure, I would say it's worth investigating your time into learning. I would also say, like, don't panic. It's not mandatory. To something you said to me earlier, I think we are careful to design JavaScript APIs first and type them. And that is really the TypeScript model of how TypeScript thinks about the world, is that it takes your JavaScript APIs as they are and then explains them. And as opposed to saying we're going to make a thing that's like where the JavaScript is an implementation detail and it's all about TypeScript APIs.
I think it's worth saying, like, people have experienced TypeScript through TypeScript users a lot, and not as much through the TypeScript designers themselves. And I think it's worth saying that, and therefore you experience a lot of like, you are doing a bad thing. For example, I would never tell someone that they should make their development server not run the code if there's red lines. But it's a super common thing. And in fact, it's super common for people to ask the question of, how do I get blocking the build? My dev server shouldn't run, is like a common thing. The answer, of course, is you shouldn't do that. You should strip types in your development server. You should run it in the browser, and your editor should give you red lines. And also you should have CI and tests that determine that, right? But it's super common for people to want that because they're used to like the Rust or Java model. And it is not a coincidence that that's not required in TypeScript, right?
Yeah.
Basically, TypeScript has a bunch of design decisions, including you can run the code when it's has red lines, including a ton of investment they made in making things like add event listener, taking a string parameter, do something, or object dot assign or object dot entries is like possible to make a type for that. Those are things like Rust could not even, which is Rust and Haskell, which are very advanced type systems, like really can't even dream of that kind of thing, because they just said string literals are not important, right? We don't need, like, we have a very advanced type system, but we don't need to care about string literals. And that is impossible. You cannot do that. You can't write the dom.d.ts if you have that opinion, other than by making it, put a very fine point on it, you really want some element that add event listener, submit, so form that add event listener submit, take an event that has the form on it, right? And the only way that works is because it knows that the submit event is a special string that does something special, right?
Yeah.
And so there's a ton of work like that TypeScript has put into modeling JavaScript APIs, and it's not just for legacy compatibility reasons. It is to enable people to make JavaScript APIs first that make sense to JavaScript user and are idiomatic, and don't have a bunch of extra stuff that is just for TypeScript. I find that a lot of other ecosystems, there's a lot of ecosystems that don't care about that, and they end up doing stuff like making you write type assertions everywhere. The angle brackets, like you say, like use foo angle bracket some type, instead of trying to make the inference system do the right thing. And in general, the TypeScript inference system is very powerful, and with a little bit of your JavaScript hat on, you can figure out how to make an API that feels nice in JavaScript and gives the TypeScript inferencer enough information to do the right thing. And if you look at my tests for any of my apps I work on with TypeScript, there's almost no types in them, because the inferencer is going to do a good enough job. Another example is there's like the asserts and the predicate functions, where you can basically have a function that you call and it tells TypeScript this is an element, or you have a function that tells TypeScript I'm going to throw exception if this is not an element, right?
Yeah.
And then TypeScript can just care about that, right? So these are all details that you could fit into your API design, and TypeScript wants that. And so, like, in the sense that TypeScript has probably like the vast majority of the work that TypeScript has done in terms of brain power has been to enable these kind of things. And therefore, I think it is that's the right way to do it. And so basically all that is to say to if you're a JavaScript user who is not yet using types, and you have not listened to Ed's exhortation that you should look into it, you still get a lot of value out of the fact that the types exist. I didn't make that point yet. So there's, first of all, the first point that I have been making is it doesn't make the API worse intrinsically. You have to do work, but you should do that. Second of all, why you should do it is because they have also done a ton of investment into making the JavaScript language server in VS Code and other editors use TypeScript under the hood, which leans on the fact that red lines aren't breaking the build, right? So basically, yes, you might not have all the information in JavaScript, and you might not even get red lines in your editor. But if you just may say like document.createElement div or form, then in a JavaScript file, TypeScript knows, or VS Code knows, without any kind of type annotations at all, that is a HTML form element. And if you say that thing, that add event listener submit, comma, and you make an arrow function with an E, tab completion on that E in a JS file in VS Code without any special added to anything, will know that it has e.form on it and stuff like that. Right. So basically that is a huge investment that they made. That is not like a thing that falls out of having a type system. And what that generally means is that if you take the time to make your API design map onto good idiomatic JS, because basically here's the problem. If you don't do that and you force people to put the angle brackets in their code, a JavaScript person can't do that. Right? So the JavaScript person is going to get an API that just has a bunch of any's or unknowns in it. But if you took the time, like in this example of document.createElement, to figure out how to teach TypeScript how to get the information out of the JavaScript values, which you can usually do, then when you're in pure JavaScript mode, you actually get the right behavior. And that is all why it is our philosophy to do that.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
And so it's a huge benefit, even if you don't use the TypeScript yourself. Like, your editor is smarter now about what's going on.
And with Glint, if you hover over a block param, it will tell you the type.
Yeah.
Right.
Exactly.
That is a fault in a nothing to do with TypeScript. You're using Glint in JavaScript mode. You hover it over, it works.
Yep.
It tells you
exactly. It's very nice. Yeah. Totally.
Okay.
Yeah. So I guess
There's one little point to make about TS users. We just spent a lot of time, which is basically what do you get? Like, what is the point for TS users? Like, we already have EmberCLI TypeScript, so what are we getting out of this? The answer is basically that right now there's a separate project it's not indefinitely typed, I don't think, but it's a separate project, which means that if there's a new beta of Ember, it doesn't have the types in it. If there's a pull request you want to try out, it doesn't have the types in it. And so there's one major benefit is like including the types with Ember means that however you got the Ember source pull request, it's a branch, it's a beta, it's a canary, it's a alpha build, has the right types, the updated ones.
Yeah.
And the second important thing is Semver, which is that TypeScript itself does not have Semver. And for that reason, EmberCLI TypeScript does not have Semver, other than like trying very hard. And when I say TypeScript doesn't have Semver, what I mean is every single minor release has a breaking changes section that tries to convince you that it's okay, but it will actually break your build. And Semver just means if there weren't red squiggly lines before, there shouldn't be any now, right? Like, so, like, not that it won't run, it will still run, but now you have to think about how to restructure your code when you upgrade TypeScript. So one of the biggest intellectual exercises of the TypeScript RFCs you're talking about is defining a definition of semantic versioning for TypeScript types that narrows what you're allowed to do a little bit from what TypeScript lets you do. But it means that we can say that the no squiggly line rule to a first approximation applies if you upgrade from Ember something to something else and you use a version of TypeScript that we didn't already have when we made the first version of Ember, the upgrade will not cause squiggly lines. That's actually a hard project, and it involved the RFC had a lot of comments from the TypeScript team. And we are planning on making tsemver.org its own thing that is useful for people who are not Ember, per our previous conversation. But that project, basically, if you like Ember's stability story, then it is not, then us telling you to use TypeScript, and by the way, that means every time you upgrade Ember or TypeScript, it might create red lines, is not compatible, right? So we have to figure out a solution to that. And like, if you're thinking it has nothing to do with Ember, you're right. It's just that we did it. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, yeah. So if we're ready to switch gears to another topic, I wanted to ask. So, shifting gears quite a lot, and deliberately so, as a contrast with some of this stuff. High level, vision level stuff. Definitely is something you expect to hear at an EmberConf. But I know that lots of people also focus on the day-to-day nitty-gritty of just like basic maintainership. How do I get like, when will this bug, why isn't that bug fixed yet? Why isn't that feature done yet? How do I get PRs merged faster? Like, the questions of maintainership and like, how do you keep open source projects moving forward, and the tensions there. Love to get thoughts on, basically like the reconciling the different perspectives of a maintainer, a kind of more casual contributor, a user. I think there's a tension. I think there's sometimes a frustration on either side of that gap.
There's a thing you said to me earlier that I think might be good to lead in with, which is why do people want their pull requests merged in the first place?
Yeah,
I think, like, if you want, can you talk?
Yeah, no, exactly. Like, I think because sometimes you definitely hear the question of like, why isn't this merged yet? It seems good, and I would often ask the question back is like, well, remember why you care that that isn't merged, and that's because the code is sitting right there, and you could run it if you like it, right? But I think a lot of people instinctively didn't want to do that, and the reason they didn't want to do that is because they realize it now becomes their problem, right? It's free as in kitten. It's something that you have to now take care of, and they recognize that that's a hassle and there's work involved. And so the whole reason you want the PR merged is because you recognize that there's a lot of value in getting other people to buy in with this idea and support it over the long run. And so if it was just about getting the code in place, you wouldn't care so much about the PR merging. You would just apply it to your own fork and go happily on your way. The long-term value in this stuff comes from the fact that it's being supported. And so that's why you care, right? That's why you want your PR merged. But that's the flip side of that is you care because you're asking for something. You're asking other people to adopt and maintain that thing forever.
Right.
Which
and I think right. And just to be clear, like, one way to imagine doing that is there's just the Ember adopted add-ons repo is just grows without bound. and you just keep putting things in there, and ostensibly people claim that it's being supported, but of course that's not true. And that is a way to claim that you're moving the responsibility to the ecosystem without actually doing it, right? Another way to do it is to try to synthesize the thing you're trying to do with the thing everyone else is trying to do. In some cases, the thing you're trying to do is a bug fix or a small behavior change that most people would agree with and would be willing to pay the migration cost, right? That happens a lot. In that case, your job as a person who's trying to get the thing to trying to make it not just your thing is to convince everyone that it's either a small thing or it's worth the migration cost, and work with other people to figure out what the migration strategy actually is, if there is any necessary. Another thing that you could do is make things more extensible so that the thing that you're trying to do isn't is going to change at a slower cadence, right? So maybe, like, I think Liquidfire historically is a good example of this, where initially it was highly coupled to Ember internals, and over time we worked to make enough Ember APIs so you don't need it. That doesn't mean that Ember's breaking changes don't ever affect Liquidfire, but they happen like every few years instead of every release, right? So these are all, they're basically, your framing is I like it, which is basically you're trying to shift responsibility from, you also think it's yourself, but it's really like your company or the project. Like, you might not work there anymore by the time it matters, right? So you're trying to shift responsibility from yourself to the community, and that is not a trivial operation. It's not. Basically, it simply doesn't work to do that by just moving it somewhere else, right? Because you have to convince people to maintain it once you did that. So now the question is, what is a general purpose structure that we can have in a project that will allow people to take things that are local to their concern and make other people maintain them for them? And that better not involve force or something, right? It better involve you convince people of something, and now you need to work very hard to make most people, the savings has to be worth the cost, right? So you have to make an environment, a community, and also a project that focuses on. There are some things that other projects, that some ecosystems can't do at all, because it's like there is not a good mechanism in our project for making the cost be worth making the savings be worth the cost. There's just no way to do it, right? So that's why things like component manager or modifier manager, right? Those things are about taking a look and saying, okay, it is very costly for people to maintain a fork of their own component system. It is also very costly for us to internally maintain 4 component systems. So what can we do that, if we take a look at what everyone wants, what everyone wants is to have interoperable components that they could share with each other, but also the ability to customize them in some obscure cases. And since that's what everyone wants, you will get actually pretty big savings by not making people have to fork. And you will also, it's not worth, if you have to make 5 different components in your system, that savings is not going to be worth the cost for a lot of maintainers, right? So if you look at the whole thing, what you have to do is you have to make an extensibility thing that lets the maintainers off the hook from having to maintain 5 different things and the combinatorial exposure of that, but also leaves everyone else off the hook from having to make a fork, right? And that's just intrinsic. I think it's very cool. I like work. It's some sense the cause of my career. It's why I work on package managers and composition, right? But I think that is how you have to think about it. And therefore, when you are thinking, why is this pull request not getting merged? It might sound like I'm just trying to talk you out of a thing. Obviously, you shouldn't. The answer to why my pull request not merged is not this story, right? This story, that's very unfair to force on people, right? But the reason that the pull request is hard to merge sometimes in a way that's not obvious is this story, right? Which is you're trying to merge a pull request, and the maintainers, and sometimes maintainers are overly conservative and just need some pushback, right? But a lot of the time, the maintainer is saying, you are asking me to add a new lint rule here, but that lint rule I can tell is a combinatorial explosion with these other lint rules, and even though it worked for me, which is one of the worst, the thing I hate the most in any GitHub comment is someone says, here's the solution, and then 20 people say, I tried to patch it, it worked for me, as if that is supposed to mean that you should merge it. It is not. You have to check if it actually works, right? And so basically you end up it is important when you submit a pull request, if it's supposed to work for everybody, you need to check that it does work for everybody. And also not only, and that's the easy part. The hard part is it has to work for people in the future. We are not there yet, and an ecosystem doesn't exist yet. So you have to have a thought process about how to balance all that. And in some sense, there's overhead that's unavoidable in the consensus and pluralism process.
Yeah,
but in
well,
another sense,
exactly,
it
exactly.
better be smaller. It better get smaller over time, or people don't have to pay those costs.
Yes.
On any given 3-month period, people who don't have to pay the costs are going to go faster. And if you get, like, this is a problem with democracy also, right? If you get bogged down too much in the process of coming to consensus, then it doesn't help you that you have a process of coming to consensus. So that is extremely important. And I think we do let's say we do a best-in-class job, where best-in-class just means, I don't know of a better answer, really, of balancing all that. And I am not willing to accept, for probably emotional, psychological reasons, the answer of, like, it's authoritarianism. Someone just decides.
Yeah.
I think, like, that just does. In my head, every time I think someone says that to answer something, I'm like, how do you know that person's right? You don't, right? So, like, you basically need a system that lets more inputs in than the benevolent dictator still means dictator. It just means the person has to benevolently listen to you, right? You need a system that doesn't require benevolence to get information into the system.
Yeah.
And that I'm just not willing to accept in any sphere of life. Parenting, democracy, like government, like my projects. I'm not willing to accept an axiom of, the answer is whatever that person decided. That's just bad. Science doesn't work like that, right? So we just don't do that. And I think that
mechanisms of self-correction, right? It's making sure that there are mechanisms of self-correction. And I think that it's a very healthy thing in open source for everybody to actually be comfortable with the idea of forks in the sense of temporary and soft and proving things out. I think 100%. A lot of organizations make it too difficult. They add a lot of friction, and a lot of it's actually quite helpful to just because of cadences and priorities and organizations with different priorities and budgets and timescales. It's totally fine. And this is it's not unlike the same reason why we have LTS releases that are a slower cadence than our every 6-week releases, right? Like, lots of changes in lots of projects are going to happen on different timescales, and that's totally okay. And one of the aspects of that is that if there's if you made a PR that's critical to you, you should run that PR until it gets merged. But you should also not leave it forever, right? Like, you should be working in good faith through the process to get it to consensus, so that you can stop being a fork and you can get it upstream.
I think there's an extremely important thing here, which is you can squeeze down these costs by having primitives. Yeah. It is frequent if you have a fork that you're maintaining, and your fork mostly is in terms of a logical primitive that is easy to convince people of, but the logical primitive is not in Ember, so now it's leaking into your whole code base. It's pretty easy sometimes to convince people to getting, at least Ember has tried to structure it in the last few years so that there's less emphasis on the ergonomics of the primitive and more emphasis on whether it's could be stable and compositional and stuff like that. And that means that you can do some of that fork. Like, yes, to a first approximation, you just do forks. But the truth is that this whole system only works if you keep paring down the costs of consensus. And this is one mechanism that is very important and has proved well for us.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there is always some cost to consensus, and that's actually important. But it comes back to the why do you care that people are merging your PRs in the first place, right? Like, because there's a value that it comes with a value. Consensus has a big value to it that you're going to now not be alone supporting.
But you want to pair out, like, basically there's two consensuses in this case. It's like, what is the composition, and there's what should the high level API be, and there's a deadlock if you try to solve them at the same time. There's irreducible complexity.
That's right. We can often do that. I mean, but this comes up even at the smallest scales, right? Of just like relatively simple bug fixes. Sometimes there could be a whole lot of reasons why the upstream maintainer, the upstream maintainer is not going to ship it on the timescale that matters to you, right? So you should totally ship it first, but then keep working with the community to get it landed. And
I think, by the way, the TypeScript changes will help here because your fork has types in it now.
Yeah, that's a good example of what's nice about first class types. Yeah.
By the way, I want to say, like, I've been noticing as a parent that, like, I have a 5-year-old kid and an almost 1-year-old. I've been noticing that, like, the world teaches the concept of, like, compromise and decision making, not the concept of negotiation and consensus. even though they are logically the same thing. Like consensus and negotiate, if you even think about it with the emotional part, it sounds harder. Now it is harder, but it's not like in the work of it, but it's not a more abstract concept. Consensus is like in a good day, you say the right thing. You say, okay, you guys should work together, figure out what works best for both of you, right? And negotiate. Leia started saying to Jonas, it's basically, instead of saying we just like some grown up is going to eventually make the decision here, and you just tell us what the story is and we'll figure it out. There's like an actual process of the two people discussing their concerns and trying to figure out what is a good solution. And we are just not teaching that to anyone ever. And therefore, it's not surprising to me that the process of consensus doesn't feel natural. It feels like the number of times in a standards body, people are like, why don't we just vote? It's like, well, we don't vote. If we voted, that would mean that one side wins and one side loses, even though there might be a solution that doesn't require that.
Yeah.
So why don't we first continue looking for the solution a little bit before we go? And yes, it takes a while, but guess what? The people who lose didn't lose them. So that seems good. Yeah. Like not good in a moral sense, but good for the process of making consensus useful.
Yes, right. Because it's a repeated game too. Like you're gonna do it again next time, and exactly.
Like every time you lose, you are not actually getting what you need out of this outcome.
Yeah.
So that basically over time, the outcome is full of things that didn't work for you, even though that wasn't necessary.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
right.
Exactly.
So you like.
Exactly.
Okay. Sorry. And now you're getting me all worked up.
No, that I wanted to. That's high quality clickbait right there.
Is there anything else to talk about?
I mean, I know we're getting a little long of time. We've got other things we could do. I mean, I was curious. You were talking about a shift in performance measurement strategies toward actual real telemetry on real mobile devices, as opposed to like what Googlebot used to measure.
Yeah, sure. So this is like a thing that is true, but also I discovered it by talking to people who are encountering it. For better or worse, like I think everyone is forced into Google's view of performance because of Google search, which frankly should be the subject of antitrust and is, but it's not legitimate that Google is allowed to define the performance metrics for the entire industry simply because of google.com. Mm-hmm. Like that is a messed up thing. And AMP literally, which is one of their attempts, is literally in the antitrust lawsuit filed by the DOJ, like in detail, not like as a sentence, because it's like not good. But anyway, for better or worse, they do get to do it. Mm-hmm. I want to say what is good. Like so what they started to do now, finally, is instead of having an ideation inside of Google headquarters to figure out what they think is a good proxy for performance, which is usually wrong. And it's wrong in a whole lot of ways. They are now using Android telemetry so there's a lot of Android phones, and they are using Android telemetry to say, okay, how long did it in practice take for this website to load on these things? Or if we care about things like interactivity, how long did it take for the page to become interactive on actual devices? Mm-hmm. The reason that there's a few reasons why this matters. I think the abstract point is what I already said, which is that it means that being fast or slow is based on reality, not based on a Google metric you have to hit. But in concrete terms, one of the things that I've been disappointed in around the investment in is there's not a lot of investment in warm cache in making the second time someone goes to your website fast. And what I mean by that is, so there's a lot of things. What I mean by that is basically if someone finds LinkedIn.com on Google and goes to it, the first time it's slow. Like it's going to be slow. For some definition is slow. But the second time, it doesn't have to be slow. Okay. Now, there's two factors that are making people not work on it. One of them is when people try to measure whether it matters, they look at warm versus cold cache. But warm versus cold cache is not a good proxy for first versus second view, because the browser will evict your cache for no reason, right? So basically, whether or not the cache was there or not is a much smaller warm cache is a much smaller percentage of second hit, basically, is one issue. I'll explain in a minute why that matters. But the second thing is that it's both easier to measure so Google already historically has used mostly first hit metrics, but also when you are trying to make your own measurements internally, you are like trying to avoid confounding factors. And what does that mean? It means get rid of the cache, right? Because the cache is a confounder. So what you end up doing is you write a script that is testing your performance, and it is only ever looking at cold. And then you say out loud in your company, oh, well, it would be really bad if first cache was very slow. So we should, so like, too bad. It's like not, that's what we have to focus on. But then you have the measurement problem where it's like Goodhart's law or something, where now that you measured it, that's the only thing anyone invests in, right?
Mm-hmm.
Even though, like, you can see logically, there's no point in time where it is good to make the user's experience after the first time faster is disproved. It's
Mm-hmm.
not, it's fully there. But for reasons that sound reasonable along the way, the only thing we're actually measuring and convince ourselves is the only thing that's important is first cache. And people will say stuff like, well, if we make the first time faster, we'll make all the things faster. And that's true as far as it goes. But also you could do much better on the second hit than the first hit for reasons that have nothing to do with the first hit. And that
Mm-hmm.
might even slow down the first hit in marginal ways,
Mm-hmm.
right? And in particular, service worker is a thing.
Mm-hmm.
And service worker allows you to cache things more aggressively, and for better or worse, while the browser happily evicts things that are used far future expires because everyone does that technique,
Mm-hmm.
service worker tends to be used more intentionally. It's less likely to be used by a CDN or something.
Mm-hmm.
And for better or worse, right now, what that means is that browsers are not evicting the service worker cache very aggressively, which means that if you use a service worker, that tends to be there. Not only that, but service worker has background syncing capabilities, which means that you don't have to wait until the user comes back to your website. In the background, you can get the new version.
Mm-hmm.
So by the time the user comes, so those are techniques that have nothing to do with like offline mode or anything else that people think is the reason. Every time I bring this up, including to clued in people, they're like, oh, we thought about that, but we didn't see the point for offline mode or whatever. And I'm not talking about offline mode. The thing I'm talking about only works if you're online, right?
Yeah.
But it allows you to implement the browser's cache in a way that makes more sense.
Yes.
And it has huge impacts on second hit,
Mm-hmm.
right? It has huge impacts. Now, the reason I'm saying all that is the good news is when you use Android telemetry instead of like whatever somebody in Google cooked up, the second hit will matter,
Mm-hmm.
right? It will actually
It'll
make
be
a
part
difference.
of your statistics. Yes.
Right.
Yes.
It's part of, you can't avoid it. It's actually there,
Yeah.
right? And so and now I don't have to make that argument philosophically.
Mm-hmm.
So the frustration I have is I don't like there's a sense in which sometimes you're just surprised at things capitalism doesn't do.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes you're surprised at things like the open source community doesn't do. Like there's really no reason. Service worker is old now.
Mm-hmm.
There's really no reason why a very simple service worker that just caches your assets and then in the background syncs it is not a thing that everyone uses. It
Mm-hmm.
doesn't have any caveats, right? The reason no one uses service worker is because they have in their head a big list of caveats, but those caveats don't apply to this use case.
Mm-hmm.
To the extent that they do apply, it's because people didn't work on it enough to iron out the bugs.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
Like maybe there's a lot of details in service worker you have to get right, and you might accidentally get stuck on an old version, but that's not intrinsic. Right?
Yes,
Those are
right.
things that happen to be true the first time some random person in your company tried to implement it.
Definitely another thing where you don't. Again, it's much better to have a consensus implementation than to try to build it all yourself.
Yes. Right. So anyway, the point of that is to say I'm just generally disappointed that this doesn't exist.
Yeah.
But I think there's a very, and I should talk about Embroider, which I think was really the original motivation, probably why you asked. But I think getting Android telemetry is just an extremely good improvement to the baseline of what's going on here. I really wish it wasn't happening because Google gets to tell you what to do. And because Android telemetry is like its own problem, but I'm not the DOJ, right? So I think I'm going to take the win here. And I'm going to say that it is good that we're doing Android telemetry, and concretely that will help here. I think the other relevant thing is it is now possible to say, so that's a good positive improvement. It is now possible to say to somebody who is concerned about that, getting on Embroider and using Embroider code splitting is the fastest way to make a huge impact. And I think people don't really appreciate the size of the impact here because we're not good at thinking exponentially. Mm-hmm. But basically, there's a huge difference between my app is just app.js and vendor.js. I have slides on this in my keynote. There's app.js and vendor.js is what my app is made out of. So if I add an admin section, my admin section is included in app.js. If I add a settings page, it's included in app.js. And even very, very good developer, there's ways to hack it, but almost no one does them, even very good people, right? And that in practice means that your critical path can't be even if you're like, oh, maybe I should not use Lodash on my critical path. Mm-hmm. It doesn't matter. There's no point in caring about that. Right. Whereas just the sentence, you should get on Embroider and get on like the Embroider strict modes. is enough information to get you have a critical path you can optimize as a real thing.
Yes.
Just using idiomatic Ember, like the guides, the things that the guides tell you.
Yep.
This is the thing we have to do in the Polaris time frame, but that's it's hard. Like, it's one of these things that I wish I could say, like, I wish I could mind meld and make people realize, like, this is the thing that's good about Ember. It makes the thing you thought about Ember 2 or 3 years ago not true about today, etc. But for some reason it's hard. But I think it is true, and it will make a difference when it lands.
Yeah, no, I mean, you've definitely talked about some of the challenges of communicating, you know, the difference between like incremental progress and like high volatility change. You know, a lot of the stuff we ship, like when you actually look at when the work starts, when the work ships, there's I don't know. I'm not finding the right words. Maybe you could summarize better. Like this challenge of explaining, like it's like slow and steady wins the race.
Yeah.
Is kind of my thinking on it. It's like
Yes.
you can avoid a whole lot of high volatility missteps that cost an awful lot, and you like trying to go fast doesn't always make you get there faster, right? I think people do have the intuitive sense of that in a lot of areas of life, right? Like if you take the time to do things properly, you finish on schedule. You're not slower. You just avoided a lot of mistakes.
Yeah. So I think the thing that I find difficult to communicate here, like every year when I'm working on the Keynote, I'm like, I find this so hard to communicate. And I want to lay out what is the paradox. Then you started to hint at what I think is the answer. So the paradox is, if you look at a 1 year time frame for Ember, it always looks like basically nothing of note is happening, right? So it's like, okay, we started working on Embroider 3 years ago. A year later, I guess we have a prototype of it. A year later, okay, I guess like somebody could use it in an app, I guess, maybe. And that like 2 years went by. In the meantime, like in every one of those years, it's like Webpack 6 has come out with new code splitting, special static, and ESM is now, like a lot of things are happening, right? And so it feels like, well, that's cool that Ember's doing this cool consensus thing, but it seems like it's making Ember go extremely slowly compared to everyone else. However, there's a paradox, which is another year goes by, you're in year 3, and now Embroider exists and every Ember app has it and it's on by default. And in the meantime, you went from Webpack 5 to Webpack 6 to Webpack 7, and probably a lot of apps that were on Webpack 5 are still on Webpack 5 and can't use any of the new features. And probably a lot of the, like React router is a good example where it's like, okay, we have nested routes because we copied them from Ember. Now we don't have nested routes. Okay, we have nested routes again, right? There's these wild gyrations that each instance of it seems like news, but then I'm sort of getting into this. But basically, there's this paradox, which is that we don't think in 3 year timeframes, nor should we make plans in like we're not going to do the Soviet 5 year plan. That's an extremely bad idea, right? So it seems like there's a problem here. How could it seems like it's easy to think, oh, it's a coincidence that Octane worked out well. It's a coincidence that Polaris is going to work out well. The truth is we could go faster if we just didn't do these, like what we're doing is these big 5 year plans. And it's like, by coincidence, it's working out okay, but it's a stupid idea because everyone knows it's a stupid idea. And what we should instead do is the thing Webpack is doing, or React, right? I think that's the paradox. It feels like, and any given, when I write my 1 year Keynote, I always have, except for the 1 year where we landed the edition, the things I'm saying are very boring. And in the meantime, there's increasing frustration that like some other ecosystems look like things are happening. So why is it so slow? But then every so often, there's like a thing that is so huge that it surprises even like me and you are very keyed into this point, and we're still like shocked at how much Octane got done, right? So you look at pre-Octane, it's like Ember.object.extend, it's like NFED. If you look at the output modules, it's like every the weird component API where you have like classing bindings. It's inner HTML, so you have elements. It's like everything's on lifecycle, like so many things. And then you look 3 years later, and it's like a thing that we felt good about, like the Glimmer.js thing is like, it seems competitive. You might not like it aesthetically, but it's not like ridiculous, right? And I do like it aesthetically, by the way. And we also made like auto tracking system that's like pretty advanced compared to whatever, right? So there's this weird thing where along the way, people are getting more and more antsy and need to get some answer for what's going on. And yet after 3 years, it seems like by coincidence, by miraculous conception, somehow we have these big switches, and also like somehow miraculously the transitions work out okay, right? Even though we have like Octane is much different than classic Ember, somehow like most Ember apps actually transition and get the benefits of Octane.
Yeah.
And basically that is I already know how to talk, like in some sense I know how to talk about that if I'm telling you the abstract answer. What I find very hard to do is to talk about it in a 1 year time frame, because that is the problem.
Yeah.
I think the breakthrough I had today talking to you earlier was an explanation. I don't know if it helps in my keynote, but it's an explanation that answers some questions, which is a volatility explanation you were pointing towards.
Yeah.
Like if you look at the stock market, right? The stock market, if you look, there could be a starting point and an ending point, and you could have one stock market that smoothly went from the starting point to the ending point, and one stock market that wildly gyrated from up and down and would have high volatility. You could look, the volatility index would be very high. So first of all, I think volatility index is generally considered a bad thing in the stock market. If volatility is high, something bad is happening. And the reason for that is that volatility causes a lot of changes to happen in the world that are then going to be reversed the next day, right? So it's not good for volatility to happen. There's a lot of reasons, but it's bad, right? You would, given the same starting ending point, you would like the volatility to be lower if possible. And in the stock market, for the whole stock market, we can't really engineer that, but it's important to look at Ember. So Ember is sort of the same thing. We have a starting and ending point. I think I was using classes as an example, right? So Ember decided that we needed to worry about native classes the same time as React decided it needs to worry about native classes. And then a few years went by, and then React landed experimental classes and then abandoned experimental classes more or less, like native. I don't know what to say here other than you're not really supposed to use native classes, and they don't really work. You can't use native classes with all the React features. You can't use hooks in them, right? So basically that is an abandoned fork of React that a lot of people adopted in the meantime. And before React actually landed hooks in a stable version of React, we actually landed full support for native classes, which happened incrementally, like a little at a time. We got rid of .get and .set, replaced them with getters and setters. We defined what the constructor is supposed to be, what is the owner parameter. We figured out how to do auto track, right? So we did all those steps, but then we actually landed native classes not as an aborted fork, but as a actual direction for the framework that you could migrate to with a migration strategy and code mods and everything in the same time frame, right? So the paradox, the answer to the paradox in that context is you thought that React landed native classes was a useful, important fact, and it looked like Ember was going slower. But in that particular context, it was not correct. Like it does in retrospect, is not true because they didn't end up doing that. They ended up doing hooks instead, and you would have been better. Like what Ember was doing was slowly and steadily, smoothly going from not having native classes to having native classes. And what React was doing was with volatility going from not having hooks to having hooks, right? So the classes in between didn't matter. The classes in between aren't even part of React going forward for the most part, but they mattered when people were looking at what Ember was doing in that time frame. And this is not a coincidence. It's not about consensus. It's not about making nice with people. The consensus process is making our design actually something that we can sustain going forward. Right. So the reason React didn't end up with classes is because they didn't want to support it going forward. So the version of classes that landed before Ember's version of classes, which was experimental, was a version that was not the future. You could land it faster because you weren't willing to commit to it. The second anyone's willing to commit to it, Ember is just as fast. That's the weird paradox, and that's the thing we observe. As soon as you account for being willing to commit to something, Ember is just as fast as everyone else. And I think the problem is that being willing to commit to something, as I said before, you don't teach the kids. It's not part of your cost analysis at all, even though you could convince someone to think hard about it. But it's not purely philosophical. It makes a big difference. Like Skylight, which is the app I work on, started in about 10 years ago with Ember and is currently using Ember with Glint and TypeScript and whatever. And there is literally no app that is not Ember that was created during the same time that is using like npm packages and TypeScript and whatever, and like modern classes and modern React. That's not a thing outside of Ember. And every one of these examples feels like, oh, well, I'm just cherry picking or something. But as a system, the system is saying we like to move smoothly, and the smoothness, just like in the stock market, has a value, and the value in terms of your own momentum. In your own app, not philosophical or nice to have or playing nice. Those are all mechanisms that we get to make your app's momentum stable.
Yes.
And if you look empirically, there's only the cases where you can talk about. I guess there's one last point I want to make, which is you can point to things that we did wrong historically because it was a self-correcting mechanism. For example, module unification was a mistake. We spent a lot of time on it. We didn't land it incrementally, and we ended up avoiding it. Now, we didn't actually ship it. We didn't commit to it. However, that is an example of something where the process of trying to find consensus in the way that we did that ended up slowing us down inappropriately. Okay, that is a thing that happened. However, you also need to look over time, how many times do we make that mistake, right? And that the process is self-correcting in some sense. So Embroider is not making that error, right? So and it's not like it's not a one-time thing. Oh, module unification to Embroider. It's like the reactivity, like Glimmer 1 was worse than Glimmer 2, which is going to be worse than Starbeam, right? And in general, there's just a question that you have to answer for how do we make the stability. I guess I'm saying two things. One, empirically, over a big enough time horizon, if you take a starting point and an ending point and compare Ember to anyone else, Ember is competitive. Yes. Like that, and people don't sometimes want to go far enough in the past and to decide that that's not justifiable, but you don't have to go that far in the past.
That's right. That's right. Well, I think it is always a messaging challenge, particularly in the JavaScript ecosystem, just because with JavaScript ecosystem's growth rate, you always have a very large fraction of developers who don't have that history, who have never been responsible for an app for 5 years.
And they want a special case. They want to say, oh, that you have to do weird things because of IE. If they don't realize that it's about consensus and commitment. So keep going. Sorry.
Yeah, no. So it's just like, it's hard to tell people, it's hard to give people answers to problems they don't have yet. Right. And so, there's definitely in the first year of an application, there's a different set of constraints than in the 6th year as the whole set of developers eventually turns over.
There are the same set of constraints, but you didn't realize them yet.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, that's a good way.
Commitments don't matter. Yes,
exactly. Yeah. If you knew, and that's why there's often a disconnect. I think as fast as, and I think I'm not trying to suggest that folks all across the JavaScript ecosystem don't learn these lessons. I think they absolutely do. It's just that by the time one crop of developers has learned it, there's now 6 times as many developers behind them in the pipeline who haven't yet. And there's just and some of the business models of software development also just encourage this kind of behavior, right? An awful lot of software gets written, tried, and thrown away in 2 years.
I think the news model of the world prioritizes volatility.
Yeah.
Right. Now I'm saying a very abstract thing, but basically something as volatile as I have news stories about it.
Right. It's easy to get
there's only one news story about Polaris.
Yes.
Right, which is in mind.
It's easy to draw attention to volatile stuff. Yeah.
Right. And nobody it even isn't that big of a deal that some of the volatility is in the down direction. It's just it feels exciting. Right. But I think what I want to say about the distant past is it is relevant that with enough of a time scale from no matter how once you get past 2 years or something, every chunk of time has a starting and ending point that looks if you draw the straight line, it looks competitive, right? I think it's just the problem is that if you draw a particular straight line like classes, somebody will have an answer to that. And what I'm trying to claim here is that our process makes that happen. It's not a coincidence, right? And so it's useful to note that if you go back 10 years, the line is more than in the 10-year line is exponentially competitive, right? And if you go, I think approximately something like a 3-year time horizon for any 3-year window. You can take any 3-year window and any feature, basically, and you have to look at our starting point and ending point, and then look at other frameworks starting and ending points. Sometimes you can't do that because the other framework didn't exist, right? So some of the 3-year time horizons, you can't do the analysis, but for any place where you could do the analysis and you want to say what was Ember's story around reactivity? What was Ember's story around modules? What was Ember's story around promises? What was Ember's story around native classes? What was Ember's what was Ember's story around bundling? Right? What is the story SSR? Right? Basically, any of these things, if you do an honest to God starting and ending point over a 3-year time horizon for any of those topics, and you compare it to a starting and ending point of something someone's willing to commit to. So Next.js counts, but I'm able to make SSR work manually with React. It does not count, right? Next.js is important because it's a real thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you look at something someone's willing to commit to, which means your app could still use it 4 years from now, or even 3, right? Then Ember always looks, I'm saying competitive, but I think Ember typically looks better, right?
Yeah.
It's just in the 1 year time frame, there's always the volatility of people who are not aiming for stability makes it like the line goes up. Our line doesn't go up. Our line their line goes up super fast. Our line is going up slowly, but then their line goes down and our line keeps going up slowly, right? And I think that the reason I keep bringing up the 3 year time horizon is it sounds like I'm making a philosophical point, but I'm not.
Yeah.
Right?
It's very practical
because we can't think at big enough time horizons.
Yep.
But practically speaking, the proof is in the pudding, and you can't find examples really. Like you can find mistakes that I will just own up as mistakes and will tell you how we have avoided making them again in the future.
Yeah.
But other than those kind of things, which are actually quite rare, even in MU, it's like, okay, well, like what is the story with ESM in Node right now? Like we're gonna have ended up having like basically Embroider is gonna have basically ESM support in Node that is like work with export maps and everything, more or less before anyone else is willing to commit to it, or at least at the same time horizon. And so the fact that everyone else had like Webpack the whole time, it is relevant. Like I actually think something around the bundler story is a mistake that deserves thinking in the sense that we've already done something in between, but I still think like it doesn't take. It's not a 5 year.
No,
right?
I mean, I think it's actually a great example of some decisions that we took early on before we had the process that we've honed since. You know, some of the decisions that we got locked into around add-ons in particular, they didn't go through the consensus process. They shipped fast because somebody wanted them, and there was just an energy in a certain area, and we didn't have the process we have now, where we would do a better job of getting consensus around them, because I don't think they weren't the quality of the designs we ship now, right? We would not have got consensus around them. I think we would have foreseen a lot of the things that lay locked in that were behaviors that we regretted.
I have a closing analogy to make here.
Yeah.
Which is that when I was back in the day in ES6 timeframe, there were 2 features that people were working on. There was web components and there was promises. There are more features, but those are the ones I want to focus on. And promises, we needed promises because we were adding modules to JavaScript. I think we didn't end up in retrospect needing them, but we were like, we need async in JavaScript. There's it's like important to have it. And so we were going to do it. And also, like the Chrome team wanted web components. Okay, so what happened with promises is TC39 has this Crucible-like consensus process that feels very painful. But in a 1 year time span, we went from having no promises at all to having promises shipped in every single browser. So the equivalent of that there's different reasons to have a consensus process, but in the web standards, the consensus process is so that you have it in every browser.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And that happened. That really happened. At the same time frame, what was happening is the Chrome team was saying TC39 is a total failure. The consensus process is a total mess. We're going to show you by shipping web components faster. We're just going to be the Chrome team. We're going to, as an authoritarian, come down and we're going to land this thing. And if you say you don't like it, we're going to tell you can wait for it till later. We're doing it now. We know what we're doing. They did that, and 5 years later, maybe now, so it's more than 5 years later now, but when I looked at 5 years later, it still didn't land. They went from web components, what eventually became V0 to V1. That took like 4 years. In the meantime, that was supposedly in service of moving quickly. And yes, you can move quickly if you don't care about other people. That is the thing you can do. But you don't only care about other people because it's like I think the Chrome team, because their consensus process is in service of browsers, has the opinion, if everyone was Chrome, we'd be fine. But no, that's actually incorrect. Now they're missing there's other people involved in the web world that have opinions that are being represented by things like Safari and Firefox that are now missing. And that will come up because web developers, including their own team like Polymer and Angular, are going to tell them, hey, this doesn't work out.
Yeah.
Right. So basically, there's always this like feeling that you have. Some people have it more than others, that if you could just put your foot down and get rid of this pointless talking, then you could move faster. And it's not just about being nice and having a kumbaya. It's about actually getting all the information in. And TC39 and Ember are both like actually pretty fast at doing that, even though it seems slow. That's the analogy, right?
I like it.
A year, they were like, a year is way too long. Like a year is crazy. We could have shipped in 3 months. Well, yes, Chrome could have shipped in 3 months and then changed it 5 times. In the meantime, Safari would have refused to ship it. Right? What is the point of that? And
I think that's a really good summary to land on.
Okay. All right. I will see everybody. I'm gonna have my keynote up as the first talk, and hopefully some of these themes will come through in some way. All right, that's it. I think wide-ranging, long conversation. Hopefully it was useful for somebody.
Yeah.
Thank you both so much for your time. We appreciate it. We'll see you all on the internet next week. Reminder that there are nearly free tickets for students and anyone who's unemployed. So if you just have some free time and you want to ramp up your skills a little bit, hear more from some of these folks, we would love to have you. See you all at EmberConf. Thank you.
Thanks.